If we start learning with a story on day one, you then get used to dealing with the whole language. You get used to contending with it as a living, breathing thing, not an object of study in a textbook. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Story Learning Podcast. Right, how do you learn difficult languages with the story learning method? This is a question that came from Carlos Rabino, 5125. Who asked exactly this: how does your method work with Russian, Chinese, or Japanese? Now, reading between the lines, Carlos, I guess what this is asking is, how do you read when the language is really difficult? And this is a question that comes through fairly often in various different forms. And we need to address this in two different ways, right? One is, well, how does story learning or reading with stories or whatever work with difficult languages as compared to easier languages? And then the second part of the question is, and then how do you use that as a beginner, right? So let's say it's like day one of learning Chinese. Like, how do you use this method there? So I guess I'm just going to talk about this, how I think about this, because it comes up quite a lot. And we do have to separate those two different phases of language learning. So big picture, we're zooming out. There is absolutely no difference whatsoever between using stories to learn Chinese or using stories to learn French. I mean, it's exactly the same thing. The reason that stories are so powerful is because it gives the most meaningful context to language. And when language has meaningful context, it doesn't get forgotten, right? So quite simply, if I teach you a difficult verb on a flashcard, right, all you've got to go on is like that word on the flashcard, right? But if you read that same difficult verb inside a story, there's a real kind of edge of your seat cliffhanger, you're just going to remember it, right? Because what you're trying to do is focus on the story, and that word serves a purpose in a story, right? And then when you read and when you are exposed to stories, you get immersed in the language in all these different ways, weird and wonderful ways. And ultimately, when you spend enough time surrounded by the whole language, you cannot help but learn. So this is the case for learning with stories in general, right? Now, the challenge that people have as learners is that if you try to read stories when you're not yet fluent in the language, it can be very difficult, right? So to take the kind of silly example of War and Peace, if you're learning Chinese and you try and read the War and Peace translation in Chinese, you're going to struggle, okay? So this is where learning resources come in, right? So this is where it becomes useful to look at Chinese learning YouTube channels, for example, or books like mine, which are designed to give you access to stories, and they're slightly simplified, not slightly simplified, they are simplified in a very, very careful, considered way, depending on your level, so that you can actually start the reading process earlier, right? Now, the goal here, the singular goal, is to get you away from studying flashcard textbook, verb table type learning, and instead to be immersed in the language in some form. Now, the criticism of books like mine is that, well, they're not exactly how a native speaker would speak, therefore they're not good learning resources. And I just, my pushback on that is I just simply disagree, right? Because if it's a binary choice between like either you read War and Peace in Russian or nothing, well, that's not helpful for anybody, right? So what we try to do is we get the smartest teachers, editors, translators that we can find, and we put our collective brains to work on figuring out, okay, if we're writing a book of short stories in Ukrainian, for example, which we have done and is going to get released very soon, and we're writing it for a B1 intermediate level, what are the linguistic compromises that we can make such that we're telling a story, the story is interesting, the language that's in there is at the right level for you right now as a B1 learner. Like this is the high wire act we're trying to achieve. We don't get it right 100% of the time. And the thing about language and linguistics is that people really do disagree. Right? It's really weird how like some of the topics that you would think are unequivocally positive, people can have the most violent disagreements over. So anyway, but something that we're doing is working because we've sold over 2 million books, and so many kind of teachers use the books, recommend it to their students. So I know that we're doing something right, but I'm not arrogant enough to think that we get it right 100% of the time. And it's not without its compromises either. When you're reading our books of stories or taking our story learning courses or whatever, I'm willing to say you are not getting the full native experience, right? But you're getting something that's arguably more useful than that for your language level, right? Anyway, so this is the case for using stories to learn languages, and whether they are Chinese or French or whatever. And I've used this approach or variations of it to learn some very, very difficult languages. So, stories are not just reading books. Stories are to be found everywhere. That's why stories are stories, the foundation of our civilization. So when I was learning Cantonese, for example, very, very difficult language, I absolutely binged certain TV series in Cantonese. There's one TV drama called Triumph in the Sky. It has like a bazillion episodes across 2 seasons. And at a time when I really wanted to make progress with the language, but I was a bit burned out at work and I couldn't really face studying, I just lay on the sofa and watched like a month worth of these TV dramas in Cantonese. And I got really absorbed in the story. It's a fantastic story, really enjoyed it. And my Cantonese improved so much over the course of binging that, even though my level at the time was probably, I don't know, A2 or something. It wasn't particularly high. But from doing that, what happened was I was immersed in Cantonese over an extended period of time where the context and the topics were contained and repeated, right? And it's the repetition that comes within well-crafted stories that actually helps you learn. And I picked up so much vocabulary from doing that. I remember my pronunciation improved a huge amount. My teacher told me after I finished that, I sounded much more native-like because I've just been exposed to it. Now, you could say that that's a case for binge watching TV, but and I guess it is. But the broader point that I'm trying to make is that it's story as a concept, and you can relate this off to immersion, to input, to comprehensible input, like whatever you like. But this is why it works. And the real secret is to make sure that you're using material that is actually comprehensible to you. If you try to read War and Peace, you ain't getting anywhere. You ain't getting nowhere. I think it's the correct grammar formulation there. But equally, if you stick with your textbooks, you're not getting anywhere near enough context to ever learn the language. And so it really is about pushing yourself in that way. Now, how does this work if you are learning the language? So in our books of short stories, as you probably know, are not intended for beginners, right? So if you are learning Japanese on day one and you pick up my book of Japanese stories, you're not getting anything out of it. These books are for you once you already know some of the language and are at a point where reading starts to make sense. Our courses, our story learning courses, Chinese Uncovered, Spanish Uncovered, French Uncovered, these are a slightly different thing. And this is my response to people asking, and this is 10 years or so ago that this first started happening, but I published my books and people would say, "Ollie, I love the method, but I'm a beginner, what do I do?" So the story learning method for me really was an attempt to make that accessible to beginners. I basically made the thing that I wanted to have. So I would think to myself, okay, if I want to learn German from scratch and I want to do it with stories, how would I do it? Now, I can't give you a book on day one of learning German, right? For obvious reasons. You don't know anything yet. But equally, I don't just want to put you through the whole textbook experience because that has all the disadvantages that we know of, right? This is why nobody ever gets fluent from learning languages at school. It just doesn't happen. So what's the middle ground? And so the middle ground, pedagogically speaking, for me was, right, well, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're starting with a story because we know on principle, if we start learning with a story on day one, you then get used to dealing with the whole language. You get used to contending with it as a living, breathing thing, not an object of study in a textbook. Well, then you start as you mean to go on. And if we get over this hurdle of actually really engaging with the language at the beginning, then you're more likely to carry on, then you're more likely to get results, and everyone lives happily ever after. And so we start with stories from the beginning, but we make them very, very simple, using things like cognates as much as possible, using every single trick in the book that we can to find ways to help you relate the language to a language that you already know, to help give you a way in to actually reading and listening to a story from day one. And at the beginning, you are not supposed to understand, right? If you know 0 words in Japanese, then you are not going to understand anything on day one. But if the story is there as the foundation, and then you have the tuition on top that comes in and says, right, that sentence here is really simple. Let me teach it to you. And now notice how that comes up again a couple of paragraphs later. And you hear this word here, this relates to that, and this word sounds a bit like this word in English, etc., etc. So we take very, very simple stories and add lots of tuition on top. So in many ways, it's not that dissimilar to a regular course. The difference is that rather than starting with a bottom-up approach, saying, okay, here are 5 individual words and here's what they mean, instead we take a top-down approach and say, here's the language being used in context in a real story. Now let's do our studying of those 5 words. Let's take those 5 words out of the story we've already read and now examine them, right? It's the content in a way is the same, but it's a fundamentally different approach. And I know for a fact that when you spend much more time surrounded by the language from day one, you are going to advance faster. Now, what Carlos is getting at in his question is, all right, well, how does this work for Japanese? And this is probably the most important distinction, that's not the right word. This is probably the most important thing to understand about story learning, the story learning method and how it works when it comes to more difficult languages, which is that when you are learning a language that has a different script, then we have to take a slightly different approach. All right. Now, in the case of Russian, you can learn the Russian script fairly quickly. That's not difficult. So in a situation like, say, Russian or Arabic, where Greek would be another example, where the script is relatively straightforward. Hiragana in Japanese would be another example. Then, essentially, if you can learn that script in a week or a weekend even, then our approach is let's sit down and learn it and get it out of the way, because a small amount of work up front means now we don't have to use romanization, right? We don't have to use the Latin alphabet, which is never accurate when you're trying to phonetically transcribe other languages. So we say, right, from the beginning, let's learn this script. And so that's why in our Japanese Uncovered course, for example, we teach hiragana from the beginning, because you can learn it in a weekend, certainly in a week, right? But for more difficult languages, this presents a real dilemma. So let's take Chinese, for example, Mandarin Chinese. Now, obviously, learning Chinese characters is one of the biggest, most difficult challenges of anywhere in linguistics, in language learning. If you learn Mandarin Chinese, you will spend essentially your entire learning life learning more characters. And so as the teacher, I cannot afford for you to wait. I can't afford to wait 5 years for you to learn to read and write Chinese before we start learning the language. Right? It's just not practical. And so this is where we take the decision to use romanization options where available. Right? And in the case of Mandarin Chinese, this is pinyin. So with pinyin, you can now start to read Chinese from the beginning because you now have access to the language via pinyin. Now, obviously, it should go without saying that there are many reasons why, there are many legitimate criticisms of that approach, okay? So it is completely valid to say that you shouldn't use pinyin to learn to read in Mandarin Chinese, for example, because you're just delaying the inevitable. Similarly with Japanese, like Romanized Japanese is horrible. But at what cost? Right? Now, if you say, right, we're not going to use romanization ever out of principle, then what that means is you are now reduced to this atomistic learning approach, because you can't read, you can't deal with the written language in any form, and you won't be able to for at least 2 years. And for me, that's not good enough. That's not a compromise that's worth making. And so what I would prefer to do is to say, like, I'm still going to stick to the highest level principle that from day one, I want you immersed in the language as much as possible, and that means reading and it means listening. If we can't read yet because it's going to take a couple of years to learn the script, well, we're going to have to use other ways to get you reading. But I want you reading so that at least you can start to see the language and how it's used. You can start to link the writing to the sounds of the language in some way, and at least we can start to just contend with the language as a living, breathing thing. And so, even if, for example, in the case of Japanese, even if we might start by using small amounts of Romanized Japanese at the beginning, what we are also doing at the same time is saying, right, let's also focus on learning hiragana and katakana right from the beginning so that we can make headway into the language and as soon as possible start to switch. So for example, in our Japanese Uncovered course, it's very deliberately staged so that you learn hiragana and katakana at the beginning in the course, and then by the end of the course, you're now doing everything fully in that hiragana and katakana. But we just have to be realistic that if we force you to learn hiragana from day one, and we don't allow you to read anything in the language until you have not only learnt hiragana, but got enough reading fluency up to read it at a decent pace, I mean, that is months, right? Yes, you can learn hiragana in a weekend, but until you can actually read it competently and fluidly, like we're talking months here, right? And again, this comes back to the point that I'm not prepared to delay the exposure, like meaningful exposure to the language for the sake of the script. Yeah, I mean, I'm going very deep into my rationale for how I put together this stuff here. But to bring it back now to Carlos's question, so how does the method work with Russian, Chinese, or Japanese? It works in exactly the same way. It's just that you have to use different levels of simplification at different stages, and we have to contend with the script in different ways to help bridge that gap so that we can get you as much exposure as possible and meaningful input in the language early on, and to allow you to interact with it in that way. You know, it's funny. One of the things I think about a lot, and I'm writing a new series of books at the moment, and I've just been writing the front matter to these books, and I've been using an analogy of comparing how we as adults learn languages, and asking the question, like, what's the perfect, ideal language learning situation? Right? If we could wave a magic wand and craft this perfect learning experience, what would it be? And in the front matter, I kind of posit that we would be dumped in a village somewhere in the country, in a homestay with people who are looking after us but don't speak a word of English, and et cetera, et cetera. And then you have to stay there for 2 years, and they have no internet and all of that. And there is this, like, for me, a kind of hypothetical ideal language learning experience. But the reality of literally everyone who learns a language in the world is that we don't have that. And so everything that we do to learn a language is a compromise of some degree. And whenever we're talking about language learning as a pursuit, it is from the start a compromise, some form of compromise on an ideal situation. And it's just interesting to think about that because it's so easy to criticize different methods and to point out the ways that they don't work, or how it would be better if you were fully immersed and all of that. But then that these criticisms often just don't contend with the reality that we are learning in isolation from home without native speakers around us. And given that reality, like, what's easier, change our reality and teleport us to some village in rural Japan somewhere, or have a learning method that actually acknowledges your situation, acknowledges your learning experience, and says, like, how do we take the best of what we know about ideal language learning environments and then make that accessible in some way to you on your sofa at home in rural Kentucky, right? And that's essentially right there what I try to do with everything in my story learning world. So anyway, that was a massive binge rant. So I hope it was useful in some way. On the topic of having resources to actually immerse yourself in, I have put together a collection of the best binge-worthy resources for becoming fluent in a new language. We have collected movies, TV series, podcasts, all of our favorites for the things that are interesting but also not too difficult, suitable for binging for fluency. And we have these in 15 different languages, including Arabic, Mandarin, Japanese. And it's completely free. You can get that by clicking the link in the description. So if you're looking for some immersion resources to binge this weekend, or just to spend a little bit more time actually immersed in the language, that's there for you. Link in the description. I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you back in the next episode of the podcast.